Hi, my name is Leah Lamb. You may or may not know that. And I wanted to share the prologue of a novel that I've been working on for a really long time. And this novel is called The Whale Dreamer. And you might be wondering, well, why are you sharing it today? And
I wanted to share the
the
prologue
reason why I'm sharing it is
of a novel
because
that I've been working on
I
for
really
a really
wanted to
long time.
honor
And this
my
novel's
dear
called The Whale
friend,
Dreamer.
my dear friend Matthew Stillman. And he's really an extraordinary human. He's a scholar. He would hate it if I use his words because he hates writing, but he's quite a skilled writer. And he is someone who has studied so many elements and so many aspects of life. Like literally every time I have a question, I'm like, I can just go ask Matthew. And Matthew was one of my super allies when I was editing this book many years ago. He actually offered to, well, he didn't offer. I asked him and he said yes to help me edit it. And he brought so much to it. And in that, um, what ended up happening was that the story came alive in a whole other way. Like if you're ever so lucky as to have someone who has a muse that can tickle your muse, where all they have to do is go like this and like whole other worlds open up. It was one of the most extraordinary creative partnerships I've ever been part of. And he's going through it right now. And so I'll talk a little bit about that on the other side. But for now, let me just bring to you, in honor of Matthew Stillman, the beginning of The Whale Dreamer. And this is just 3 pages. It's short, but it's called The Prologue. In the beginning, they say on the day Kelly Christensen was born, 33 minutes after her mother went into labor, 33 egrets flew into Castley Memorial Hospital. They soared the harshly lit and sterile hallways, generated a wind as they flapped their wings, leaving a wake of empty space in their path as doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors jumped out of their way as they honked and squawked their way through the hospital and up the staircases to the 8th floor where Kelly's mother was giving birth. The large, white, gangly birds made several stops on their search for Kelly. One white bird rested single-footed with an elderly man whose crystal blue eyes stared in such a way it was hard to know which world he was seeing. Another great bird was found in an operating room where a small boy was having his appendix removed. And when the local newspapers reported about the situation, they informed the community of Castling that no harm was done, plenty of patients were cheered, and the birds flew out the very same hospital door that they flew in. What the newspapers didn't report were the details the nurses and doctors didn't share, because some things simply can't be explained with words. But sometimes when Mrs. Jones, the oldest nurse in the hospital, was tending to a young child whose life was being taken in those final moments of life, if she felt fear in the child and the parents weren't in the room, she'd cuddle up close, warming the child with her soft and generous body, and give the child a story it could carry into the other world, because after all, Mrs. Jones is quite convinced the other world is where this story comes from. Once upon a time, Mrs. Jones began, not so long ago, a baby girl was born in this very hospital just a few doors down the hall. Mrs. Jones often gestured as if it was just across the hall, when in actuality, Kelly was born 2 floors and 3 worlds away from the intensive care unit. But this child wasn't like any other. She didn't come in on her own. This child came in with a cold wind brought by a flock of great white birds. Everyone knows the story about the day the birds filled the hospital. What they don't know, and this is when Mrs. Jones stopped for a long, dramatic pause and leaned in close so the child could smell the sweet scent of fennel seeds she chewed to assist her digestion. Sure, all those birds flew through the hospital, and yes, they stopped in many rooms, but they were all on their way to one place, the room where Kelly was about to be born. Now, mind you, The nurses and the doctors tried to keep them out, but they put up an awful protest, flapping their humongous wings and squawking up a storm. And as much as we shooed them and tried to corral them, we could push them out the windows. There wasn't anything we could do because, you see, those birds weren't normal. Those were ghost birds. You could see right through them. Even though they looked like birds and acted like birds and sounded like birds, they were actually just apparitions of birds. Try as we might to catch them, our hands just went right through those strange ghost bodies because there is nothing you could actually touch. And as if there wasn't strange enough, their presence made the room so cold we had to bring in heaters to stop the mother's teeth from chattering. The birds formed a circle around the mother, and when Kelly made her way out of the birth canal and arrived in this world, the birds sang. Their song filled the room with so much noise that I could barely hear the doctor shouting orders at me. But this much I know is true. And in that moment, Mrs. Jones often warmed the dying child's cold hands by placing them in her own. When Kelly left the oceanic realm of her mother's womb and breathed life in this world for the very first time, so did those birds. They stopped being ghost birds and started being real birds. And then the room warmed up. So we opened the windows and tried to shoo them out, but they still wouldn't go. And you know, they weren't about to kill a bunch of ghost birds that had just come back to life. No way, no how. Oftentimes a child would look up at Mrs. Jones and wonder as it tried to figure out if she was trying to tell them that they could come back to life after becoming a ghost. And maybe she was. And maybe she wasn't. Once those birds came to life, they made a real mess of this place. They dropped feathers and pooped all over the room, but we still didn't do anything to harm them. We waited until it got dark so we wouldn't attract any more attention than necessary. And then we put the mother into a wheelchair with her baby, and all those birds gathered around, and some even got on the chair itself, and we rolled them right down that hospital corridor. That's when Mrs. Jones would gesture to the hallway outside the child's door, making it so almost as if they looked in that direction, they might actually see Mel in her wheelchair, holding baby Kelly in her arms, with a flock of white birds walking, flying, and clinging to every part of the wheelchair they could get a talon onto as they rolled through the hospital corridor. As the birds flew over, they dropped feathers, real feathers, all over Mel, Kelly's father, Paul, tried to brush the feathers off of her, but Mel placed her hand over 3 of those feathers, hoping no one would see, and tucked them away in the blanket wrapped around Kelly. Once they got out of the front door, all 33 birds flew into the night, forming a line that headed straight toward the moon. I have proof that all this happened. That is when Mrs. Jones took out a long white feather from her pocket, dirty and crumpled, more gray than white from all the hands that had held it, and placed that feather into her hand of the child in its final moments, just before death, to accompany them as they returned to the place where this story comes from. So that's the prologue to The Whale Dreamer. And I'm nearly done. It's very exciting. It's been quite an experience in the process. And I wanted to share it because my dear friend Matthew Stillman is in quite a situation. They found a tumor in his brain. And he has one of those GoFundMe campaigns that's up and going. And, you know, I experienced having cancer many, many years ago. And something happened that was so magical and miraculous that I wanted to create a space for it to happen here if the life inspires you of this story, which was that I had worked for many years up in Alaska Wildland Adventures as a natural history guide. And somewhere along the way, word got to that community. And I don't know if they like sat down one night and just like all wrote cards together, But like I got like so many cards, so many. This is back when people used to write, cards. I got so many cards from that community. I can't remember honestly who they came from, but there's one that I remember. And it came from this woman who I'd never met. And she said, Leah, I don't know you, but the way that people talk about you, I just wanted to send you some good healing energy, and I wish you all the best. And it struck me as such an extraordinary act of generosity that somehow the spirit of life travels in such wondrous, magical ways. And that she had reached out of her bubble and into mine while I was in the middle of this kind of crazy health crisis. And it really touched me so profoundly that, look, I'm still here talking about it, like 2 decades later. So many of you don't know Matthew Stillman, and you'll never meet him. But what I can tell you is that he is extraordinary, and he is a scholar's scholar. And if you really want to get on an amazing newsletter list, Primal Dermal, he creates this extraordinary salve from the talon. I'm not going to say this right. From the tallow, from beef tallow. He gets this all organic beef tallow, and it's an ancient tradition. Actually, the tallow has a cellular structure that's closer to ours than most other moisturizers. So it's actually an incredible moisturizer among many other things. And so he's part of keeping these ancient practices alive. And then every week or so, he will write something long, a beautiful missive about some kind of ancient piece of information by keeping it alive. And if we can feel his life in some beautiful ways right now, I think it would be lovely. So if you feel inspired, his GoFundMe there's one click away. I'll bring it over here and wave a hello and maybe get on his list and get to receive the gifts of this good man. And meanwhile, if you want to stay in touch and want to be part of the Whale Dreamer, I'll put links on for that too. And wishing you all the best, and may you have lots of magic and beauty and all the great things in your world. And